Karaite Judaism or Karaism, and more accurately Karaite Judaism or Naraism, is a Jewish movement characterized by the recognition of the Tanakh alone as its supreme legal authority in halakha and theology. It is distinct from mainstream rabbinic Judaism, which considers the oral Torah, as codified in the Talmud and subsequent works, to be authoritative interpretations of the Torah. Karaites maintain that all of the divine commandments handed down to Moses by God were recorded in the written Torah without additional oral law or explanation. As a result, Karaite Jews do not accept as binding the written collections of the oral tradition in the Midrash or Talmud. When interpreting the Tanakh, Karaites strive to adhere to the plain or most obvious meaning of the text. This is not necessarily the literal meaning, but rather the meaning that would have been naturally understood by the ancient Israelites when the books of the Tanakh were first written. By contrast, Rabbinic Judaism relies on the legal rulings of the Sanhedrin as they are codified in the Midrash, Talmud, and other sources to indicate the authentic meaning of the Torah. Karaite Judaism holds every interpretation of the Tanakh to the same scrutiny regardless of its source, and teaches that it is the personal responsibility of every individual Jew to study the Torah, and ultimately decide personally its correct meaning. Karaites may consider arguments made in the Talmud and other works without exalting them above other viewpoints. The approach of Protestants during the much later Reformation was similar, in terms of saying each individual could read and interpret the Bible. According to Rabbi Avraham ben David, in his Sefer HaKabbalah, the Karaite movement crystallized in Baghdad in the Gaonic period, under the Abbasid Caliphate in what is present-day Iraq. This is the view universally accepted among rabbinic Jews. But some Arab scholars claim that Karaites were already living in Egypt in the first half of the 7th century, based on a legal document that the Karaite community in Egypt had in its possession until the end of the 19th century, in which the first Islamic governor ordered the leaders of the Rabbinite community against interfering with Karaite practices or the way they celebrate their holidays. It was said to have been stamped by the palm of Amr ibn al-As, the first Islamic governor of Egypt, and was reportedly dated 20 Historians have argued over whether Karaism has a direct connection to anti-rabbinic sects and views, such as those of the Sadducees, dating back to the end of the Second Temple period, or whether Karaism represents a novel emergence of similar views. Karaites have always maintained that, while there are some similarities to the Sadducees, due to the rejection of rabbinical authority and the oral law, there are major differences. The ancestors of the Karaites were a group called Beni Sadek during the Second Temple period. Karaites at one time made up a significant proportion of the Jewish population. Estimates of the Karaite population are difficult to make because they believe on the basis of Genesis chapter 32 that counting Jews is forbidden. Some 30–50,000 are thought to reside in the 21st century in Israel, with smaller communities in Turkey, Europe and the United States. Another estimate holds that, of the 50,000 worldwide, more than 40,000 descend from those who made Aliyah from Egypt and Iraq to Israel. History. Origins. Arguments among Jewish sects regarding the validity of the oral law can be dated back to the 1st and 2nd centuries BCE. Accordingly, some scholars trace the origin of Karaism to those who rejected the Talmudist tradition as an innovation. Rabbi Judah Halevi, an 11th-century Jewish philosopher, wrote of defense for Judaism entitled Sefer HaKuzari. Tabei and Simon B. Shetter, with the friends of both. At this period arose the doctrine of the Karaites in consequence of an incident between the sages and King Janai, who was a priest. His mother was under suspicion of being the profane woman. One of the sages alluded to this, saying to him, "Be satisfied, O King Janai, with the royal crown, but leave the priestly crown to the seed of Aaron." His friends prejudiced him against the sages, advising him to browbeat, expel, and scatter or kill them. He replied, "If I destroy the sages, what will become of our law? There is the written law," they replied. "Whoever wishes to study it may come and do so. Take no heed of the oral law." He followed their advice and expelled the sages, and among them Simon b. Shetter, his son-in-law. Rabbinism was laid low for some time. The other party tried to establish a law built on their own conception, but failed, till Simon b. Shetter returned with his disciples from Alexandria, and restored tradition to its former condition. Karaism had, however, taken root among people who rejected the oral law, and called all kinds of proofs to their aid, as we see today. As regards the Sadduceans and Boethosians, they are the sectarians who are anathemized in our prayer, noted, in the times of John Hyrcanus and Alexander Jannaeus his son, sprung up the sect of the Karaites, in opposition to the Pharisees, who had introduced traditions and set up the oral law, which these men rejected. In the times of the said princes lived Simeon ben Shetich and Judah ben Tabbi, who flourished am 3621. These two separated, the latter from the former, because he could not embrace his inventions which he formed out of his own brain, and from him the Karaites sprung, who were first called the Society or Congregation of Judah ben Tabbi, which was afterwards changed into the name of Karaites. Gill also traces the Karaite sect to the split between the schools of Hillel the Elder and Shammai in 30 BCE. American scholar Bernard Revel, in his 1913 published dissertation on Karaite Halakha, rejects many of Geiger's proofs. Revel also points to the many correlations between Karaite Halakha and theology and the interpretations of Philo of Alexandria, the 1st century philosopher and Jewish scholar. He also notes the writings of a 10th century Karaite who refers to Philo's works, showing that the Karaites made use of Philo's writings in the development of their movement. Later medieval Karaite commentators did not view Philo in a favorable light. These attitudes show a friction between later Karaite theology and possible connections to Philo's philosophy, which could serve as either a rejection of their origins, rejection of theological positions no longer accepted, or that Philo's philosophy was not entirely used in the founding of the Karaites. Early 20th century scholars Easterly and Box suggested that Karaism formed in a reaction to the rise of Islam. The new religion recognized Judaism as a fellow monotheistic faith, but claimed that it detracted from its belief by deferring to rabbinical authority. 9th century Anan ben David is widely considered to be a major founder of the Karaite movement. His followers were called Ananites. They did not believe the rabbinic Jewish oral law was divinely inspired. According to a 12th century rabbinite account, in approximately 760 CE, Shlomo ben Isdai II, the Jewish exilic in Babylon, died, and two brothers among his nearest kin, Anan ben David and Ananiah, were next in order of succession. Eventually Ananiah was elected by the rabbis of the Babylonian Jewish colleges and by the notables of the chief Jewish congregations, and the choice was confirmed by the Caliph of Baghdad. A schism may have occurred, with Anan ben David being proclaimed exilic by his followers. However, not all scholars agree that this event occurred. Leon Nemoy notes, Natrone, scarcely 90 years after Anan's secession, tells us nothing about his aristocratic descent or about the contest for the office of exilic which allegedly served as the immediate cause of his apostasy. He later notes that Natrone, a devout rabbinite Jew, lived where Anan's activities took place, and that the Karaite sage Yaakov al-Kikisani never mentioned Anan's purported lineage or candidacy for exilic. Anan's allowing his followers to proclaim him as exilic was considered treason by the Muslim government. He was sentenced to death, but his life was saved by his fellow prisoner, Abu Hanifa, the founder of the great school of Muslim theology and jurisprudence. Ultimately he and his followers were permitted to migrate to Palestine. They erected a synagogue in Jerusalem that continued to be maintained until the time of the Crusades. From this center, the sect diffused thinly over Syria, spread into Egypt, and ultimately reached Hesse, Europe. Ben David challenged the rabbinite establishment. Some scholars believe that his followers may have absorbed Jewish Babylonian sects such as the Isunians, Yudganites, and the remnants of the pre-Talmudist Sadducees and Boethusians. Later, sects such as the Euchabrites emerged separately from the Ananites. However, the Isunians, Yudganites, Euchabrites, and Mishawites all held views that did not accord with those of either the Ananites or the Karaites. Abu Isa al-Isfahani, who was an illiterate tailor, claimed to be a prophet, prohibited divorce, claimed that all months should have 30 days, believed in Jesus and Muhammad as prophets, and told his followers that they must study the New Testament and the Quran. Yudgan was a follower of Isa al-Isfahani and claimed to be a prophet and the Messiah, saying that the observance of Shabbat and holy days was no longer obligatory. Ismail al-Yukhbari believed he was the prophet Elijah, and hated Anan. Mishaway al-Yukhbari, who was a disciple of Ismail al-Yukhbari and the founder of the Mishawites, taught his followers to use a purely solar calendar of 364 days and 30-day months, insisting that all the holy days and fast days should always occur on fixed days in the week, rather than on fixed days of the months. He further said that Shabbat should be kept from sunrise on Saturday to sunrise on Sunday. Most Ananites and Karaites rejected such beliefs. Anan developed his movement's core tenets. His Sefer HaMiswot was published about 770. He adopted many principles and opinions of other anti-rabbinic forms of Judaism that had previously existed. He took much from the old Sadducees and Essenes, whose remnants still survived, and whose writings, or at least writings ascribed to them, were still in circulation. Thus, for example, these older sects prohibited the burning of any lights and the leaving of one's dwelling on the Sabbath. A large number of Karaite works were produced in all parts of the Muslim world. Karaite Jews were able to obtain autonomy from Rabbinite Judaism in the Muslim world and establish their own institutions. Karaites in the Muslim world also obtained high social positions such as tax collectors, doctors, and clerks, and even received special positions in the Egyptian courts. Karaite scholars were among the most conspicuous practitioners in the philosophical school known as Jewish Kalam. According to historian Salo Whitmeyer Baron, at one time the number of Jews affiliating with Karaism was as much as 40% of world Jewry. Debates between Rabbinite and Karaite leaders were not uncommon. Most notable among the opposition to Karaite thought and practice at this time are the writings of Rabbi Saadia Gaon, which eventually led to a permanent split between some Karaite and Rabbinite communities. Russian Empire Karaites. During the late 19th century, Russian authorities began to differentiate Karaites from Rabbinite Jews, freeing them from various anti-Semitic laws that affected Rabbinic Jews. The Tsarist governor of the Crimean area told the Karaite leaders that, even though the Tsarist government liked the idea that the Karaites did not accept the Talmud, they were still Jews and responsible for the death of Jesus and subject to the new anti-Semitic laws. The leaders, hearing that, devised a ruse by which they could be freed of the oppressive laws and told him that the Karaites had already settled in the Crimea before the death of Jesus. The Tsarist government then said that, if they could prove it, they would be free of the oppressive laws. The community leaders charged Avraham Furkovich with gathering anything that could help prove that Karaites were not in Jerusalem at the time of Jesus, and thus not responsible for the crucifixion. Through his work, Furkovich helped establish the idea among the Tsarist authorities that the Karaites, as descendants of the exiled northern kingdom of Israel, had already gone into exile centuries before the death of Jesus and thus had no responsibility for it. Furkovich referenced tombstones in Crimea and gathered thousands of Karaite, Rabbinite, and Samaritan manuscripts. including one rabbinite document from the Southern Caucasus that claims that the Jews there were descendants of the exiles from the northern kingdom of Israel. These actions convinced the Russian Tsar that Karaite ancestors could not have killed Jesus and that thus their descendants were free of familial guilt. All this served for external consumption. Within the community, Achaemim still taught that the Karaites were and have always been a part of the Jewish people. Prayer was in Hebrew. The lineage of Kohanim, Levites, and families of Davidic descent were meticulously preserved, and books printed in Hebrew adamantly identified the Karaites as Jews. In 1897, the Russian census counted 12,894 Karaims in the Russian Empire. By the early 20th century, most European Karaites were no longer very knowledgeable about the religion, and Sariah Sapsel, a Karaite soldier of fortune who had been the tutor of the last Qajar Shah of Persia Muhammad Ali Shah Qajar and a Russian spy, managed about 1911 to get himself elected chief Achaem of the Karaites in the Russian Empire. Influenced by the Pan-Turkic movement in Turkey, Sapsel made his position into that of an emperor-priest. He changed the title Achaem to a Khan, forbade the use of Hebrew, and in the 1930s introduced pagan elements. He recognized both Jesus and Muhammad as prophets. After the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, atheism became official state policy in Soviet territories, and Karaite religious schools and places of worship were the very first religious institutions closed by the Soviet government. The authorities allowed only the teaching of Sapsalian doctrines about the Karaites, and the official stance according to Soviet law erroneously regarded the Karaim as Turkic descendants of the Khazars and not as Jews. Not all European Karaites accepted the Sapsalian doctrines. Some Achaemim and a small part of the general Karaite population still preserved their Jewish heritage, but most dared not oppose Sapsel openly due to his official standing vis-a-vis the Soviet government.